Welcome to the Weaver Sews. I'm Daryl Lancaster. I use bias strips of commercial fabrics a lot when constructing my handwoven garments. Many of my seam finishes use bias strips, and quite often I trim the perimeter edge of jackets, vests, armholes, necklines. Bias makes a tidy trim that keeps edges defined, controlled, and supported. So let me show you some of the pieces that I've done. Let's start with this hand-woven jacket here. The fabric was actually woven by one of my guildmates for a design challenge, and then we sort of swapped things. It was actually lots of fun. So I made this jacket out of this fabric that used my yarns, and my guildmate wove the fabric. So here I've trimmed the entire perimeter of this jacket, this hand-woven jacket, with a bias strip of linen. You can see it goes all the way around the edge, mitering at the corners. And on the inside, I have used that same linen to make a Hong Kong seam finish and a welt finish. I've even used bias strips to create the button closure. This vest was woven from hand-dyed warps from a Catherine Weber workshop. Catherine Weber sells hand-dyed warps under the name of Blazing Shuttles. That link will be in the show notes. Here you can see I've used bias linen to trim the entire perimeter of this vest and the armhole as well. I've even used bias strips to connect the collar, to keep with the theme of external seam finishes. This hand-woven coat with a hand-woven Inkle band trim has a beautiful sari lining. I've used part of that sari lining to create a bias strip which trims the hem. This hand-woven tunic is something you would pull over your head. It's not something that you would take off like an unlined jacket. So the seam finishes inside don't need to be nearly as fussy as they do in an unlined jacket. If you look inside, you'll see that I have used a bias cut nylon tricot, 15 denier nylon tricot, to trim the edges. They remain flexible and soft without any bulk. And I have used that same tricot on the hem, which worked really nicely for shaping the curve. This is a hand-woven skirt. I can't wait till the cold weather's in so I can actually wear it. I made it earlier this spring, and it was a little overkill for New Jersey summers. Here I've used that same tricot, that same 15 denier nylon tricot cut on the bias for my Hong Kong seam finish and for my hem finish. This is another hand-woven coat that I did, and even though it's completely lined on the inside, I've used bias to trim the garment and defined design lines with piping. So here you can see the raglan sleeve design line is defined by piping, and the entire perimeter of the coat has piping as well. And that is using a bias strip. This vest uses a lot of bias. I have the entire perimeter is bias cut wool crepe. The button closure was created with bias strips. And because this vest was created with leftover hand-woven fabric from another project, I have pieces that are all fused onto a backing, and all of the butted joints are trimmed with bias tubes. I use that same technique when I create my tote bags that are made also from leftover fabric. And you can see that this tote bag was made from the scraps of the coat that's on the dress form behind me. You see all of the butted joints have some ultra suede tubes. And this tote is actually available for sale on my website. I will cover how to do all of these seam and edge finishes in future videos, but today I want to talk about how to efficiently cut a length of cloth into bias strips. First, let's review what bias is. I have already posted a video on grain lines and working with the grain. Please reference that video. The link is in the show notes below. Here's a length of commercial cloth. There is a fold at one edge. I usually cut my bias strips with the fold still in place since most commercial fabrics are 45 to 60 inches wide, and for my metric friends that would be 115 to 150 centimeters wide. The lengthwise grain of the cloth is parallel to a warp thread, also parallel to a selvage. And the crosswise grain is perpendicular to the selvage. It would be parallel to a weft thread. In the perfect world, the lengthwise grain and the crosswise grain are at a 90-degree angle to each other. Always start with fabric that has been straightened on one edge, at least one edge, and pre-washed. This is pretty important. So I want to show you how to straighten a piece of commercial fabric, but I'm not going to do it on this because this would be too easy. This actually has a jacquard weft design that makes it really easy to just cut along the design line, and then I don't have to technically straighten it. I'm going to work with this beautiful piece of a wool twill. Actually, I wished I had woven it. This is a lovely commercial fabric, and I actually think that it would make great bias strips because then you would have this beautiful diagonal line across the length of the strip. But to straighten the edge, first we begin by opening out the cut edge and assessing where the low spot is. This particular fabric has the low spot in a very odd place. Typically, the low spot might be at this selvage edge or at the fold, depending on how it was cut when you purchased it. But this has the low spot in a very weird place, so we're going to start there. I'm going to use that low spot, and I'm going to begin to pull a thread. And it will travel up like a pull in the fabric right along the actual crosswise grain line. And I pull 4 to 6 inches, maybe more, depending on whether the thread eventually breaks. Then I'm going to cut right along that pulled thread line. And here I'll continue all the way to the selvage. Now, because the low end started midway in the fabric, I'm going to flip it around and continue in the other direction, all the way to the other selvage. So, occasionally, you will find that when you refold the fabric, once it's been straightened, that the two cut edges don't line up. This means that the fabric, though woven on grain, has been skewed in some way when it was boarded for shipment to a retailer and then subsequently cut and sold. It's important to straighten the skew first before cutting anything out of a fabric that no longer has grain lines at right angles to each other. So this fabric is definitely skewed. Though it's been straightened, the grain lines don't lie at right angles to each other. And it was pretty obvious when I was doing the straightening that I started out at one selvage with very little, and it grew in width until I got to the other selvage. This is very common with fabrics from inexpensive retailers, and it's very unfortunate when it happens. So let me demonstrate how to get a fabric that is skewed to this degree back on grain. First, we're going to determine the short ends of the rectangle. So in this case, this is short, and on the other side, this is short. So what we need to do is carefully but firmly pull the short ends on the diagonal until the fabric returns to square. Now, this is most easily accomplished when you have a second pair of hands. When I don't have an extra set of hands in the studio, what I'll do is actually stand on the opposite diagonal corner and pull up from there. And that has worked well for me as well. So let's check this. This is considerably better, but it isn't good enough. And at this point, I would redo what I just did and pull it back on grain even more. Sometimes in severe cases, the fabric actually has to be re-wetted. Now that we have a folded length of commercial fabric that will be suitable for whatever it is we are trimming, and it has been pre-shrunk, usually just by placing the fabric in hot water for 20 minutes, rolling in a towel and hanging to dry, and that fabric grain is squared up. So now we can talk about bias. Assuming at this point that the lengthwise grain or warp and the crosswise grain or weft are at right angles to each other, the 45-degree bisection of that 90-degree angle is called the true bias. It's pretty stretchy, which is what you want. Any trim that's added to a garment must be able to flex around an edge and around curves. So let's do a little math here. 3/4 of a yard of 45-inch wide fabric will yield about 12 yards of 2-inch strips. And for my metric friends, 68 centimeters of 114 centimeter width fabric will yield about 11 meters of 5-centimeter strips. Those measurements will be reprinted below in the show notes. Start by bringing the warp to the weft, creating a 45-degree bias line. This line is the true bias. So for camera purposes, I want to have you focus on this bias line. All cuts will be parallel to this line. Now, assuming that your cutting table does not have a 2-yard rotary cutting mat across it, and that you don't have arms that reach 4 feet, it's more efficient to fold the bias line to shorten it so that it's easier to cut. The first fold is pretty straightforward. Grab the upper part of the bias line and bring it to the lower part of the bias line, essentially folding the bias line in half. The next fold confuses people. All you're doing is repeating the first step. Grab the upper end of the bias line and bring it to meet the lower end. I have watched students grab other corners and get hopelessly lost in some origami creation. Don't overthink this. Simply fold the bias line as many times as is necessary to get it to fit within the rotary cutting equipment that you have. I like this Olfa ergonomic rotary cutter. It can be adjusted for left or right-handed use. In addition, you'll need a long see-through ruler and a good rotary cutting mat. I actually prefer using my Olfa mat over my 2-yard version that covers my cutting table. If the folded edges of the bias line up over each other, then the first cut I make is usually half the width I need because there's a fold involved. But if the folded edges of the bias are slipping all over the place like they would with, say, nylon tricot, Bemberg rayon lining, or silk habitai, then just cut off the fold and start with a clean edge. This fabric is pretty stable, so I'll make my first cut half the desired width. I find hand position important when using a rotary cutter. The index finger rides on the ridge of the cutter to add steering ability and force. And again, because I need 2-inch wide bias strips, my first cut will be 1 inch wide. Start just below the edge of the fabric with the blade along the ruler edge. Push down into the board firmly and away from you, creating a clean cut. You should hear something like a scritching sound. I prefer placing the ruler on what I'm cutting off. The ruler measures easily what I'm cutting and it protects it from shifting. Check that you have a clean cut, and a fresh blade helps. Carefully lift the first stack of bias, and since this was cut on the fold, once opened up, you will have a strip of the correct width. Continue cutting the desired width bias strips, moving the ruler each time across the length of the fabric. Note that when inspecting the bias strips, you might come across this V in the strip. The first instinct will be that you did something wrong. No, the V happens because you started with a folded length of fabric. If you wish to avoid the V, start with a single layer, which gets a little unwieldy when the fabric is 60 inches wide. So usually I just cut the V, squared, and now I have 2 pieces. The last thing I want to cover is how to join bias strips. If you need a strip that is longer than what you have in your pile, then you'll need to piece the two together. Typically for garments, you only need short or medium lengths, so a side seam, an armhole or a shoulder. You would never create long continuous bias. That's kind of a waste of time. Upholstery work or the perimeter of a quilt would require a long continuous piece, but garments require short lengths. The exception being possibly a hem or the perimeter of a jacket, like I've already shown. To join 2 strips of bias, we're going to square off the ends, although it is entirely possible to piece bias using that mitered edge. Spatially, I find it very challenging for a lot of my students, so I like to just square off the 2 edges. To join 2 strips of bias, we squared off the ends, and now we're going to place them right sides together at right angles to each other. You will be stitching across the corner from one intersection to the other. Let me just chalk that so you can see exactly where I'll be stitching. Here, I have actually stitched across the corner, back stitching at either end. If your machine balks with a slippery lining, you can, instead of back stitching, tie off the tails at either end, and that will secure it. Or slip a piece of tissue paper underneath before stitching. And then when you're finished stitching, just tear off the tissue paper. Trim the excess seam allowance. And The seam is then distributed diagonally across the bias, making the join less bulky when the bias is applied to the garment. On the wrong side, you'll press open the seam allowance. A couple of years back, I created a series of videos for Threads Insider, which is a video subscription service for readers of Threads magazine. They have all kinds of videos available from many well-known sewing educators. And I can honestly say that there is some great stuff in those videos. I recorded 9 videos during the couple of days that I spent at the Taunton Press facility. One of the videos I created also talks about creating bias strips. You might want to check out that episode, but I highly recommend subscribing to the site. There is a wealth of information to be had on all kinds of tips and techniques for garment sewing. There's even a 14-day free trial. So that link will be in the show notes below. I'm Daryl Lancaster for The Weaver Sews.